Here are some video snippets from YouTube and Shutterstock showing abdominal muscles. For most people, the lower abdominal pack is one mass that feeds into the pelvic region. Other people have more prominent crescent shapes that form 8 or 9 packs for the entire length of the torso. The ab impression is visibly asymmetrical, and this is an important effect that I want to echo onto the Y.E.S rig. One thing I think is worth distinguishing when it comes to muscle impressions is impressions produced by regular contraction and extension of muscles versus impressions produced by intentional flexing. Obviously, impressions produced by intentional flexing produce more intense impressions, and this is a feature worth extending to the rig. So I'm considering a parameter called flex that intensifies the abdominal impression on intention. The way in which I intend on using my sculpt deformers will also give me access to another feature which I will be calling muscle swelling. As you will see, this will be a very useful feature that an animator can play with to simulate some cool effects. Now, here's some reference footage of stomach vacuums. Initially, I was interested in the reference only because it helped show the outline of the ribs. But now I realize that the effect of a stomach vacuum is an exaggeration of inhalation. One of the very important principles of animation is exaggeration. My goal with the ribcage impression and the abs is to trigger one or the other. The character's chest rotating backward would simulate inhalation and trigger the ribcage impression. And in opposition, the chest rotating forward will trigger the abdominal impression. But in order to exaggerate the effect of inhalation on a backward rotation of the chest, I'm going to simulate a stomach vacuum to work in conjunction with the impression of the ribcage. By itself, the impression of the ribcage on a basic inhalation or backward rotation of the chest is simply not noticeable enough to draw the eye. Here is some reference showing people inhaling regularly. In some instances, the superficial change is only noticeable because we are close enough. Inhaling can be a very underwhelming action depending on how intensely a person performs it. So this is why I believe the exaggeration of the ribcage impression effect by combining it with a stomach vacuum will make for some clear messaging when the character inhales or rotates their chest backward. But just like with the abdominals, I want to provide the animator with parameters that can be used to turn off or de-enhance the effect of the stomach vacuum. I acknowledge that not everyone will be a fan of the effect, and maybe some would just like to turn off the effect of the stomach vacuum. This means that I have to separate both effects. And the way I've decided to do that is to use a sculpt deformer for the impression of the ribcage and an in-context blend shape for the sculpting of the vacuum effect. This is a great solution because the vacuum effect is a recessed effect that will be a lot easier to accomplish with an in-context blend shape. Sculpt deformers do a better job with bulging or protruding effects, and therefore will do a good job with the last couple of ribcage bones on the bottom half of the ribcage that I want to show on a backward rotation of the chest. Now, all these effects that I want to add have to integrate well with the stretchable spine of this advanced skeleton rig. The IK and FK spine of this advanced skeleton rig have volume controls that should not break the effect of the rib cage, the stomach vacuum, or the abdominal impression. So, I decided to do the development of the rib cage and the abdominal sculpt deformers in ZBrush. My goal is to simplify the end result with Z remesher so I have something I can use in Maya without too much penalty on performance. I started with a version of Y.E.S that has her limbs trimmed off, and I filed down her breast tissue to start work on the rib cage and abdominal meshes. So as I mentioned before, when it comes to the rib cage and the abdominals, I'm going with either showing a rib cage on this exaggerated deep inhalation effect or abdominals on a crunch or when the character intentionally flexes. When your abs are flexed, they are superimposed over the ribcage, and the impression of the ribcage recedes behind the abdominals. So in this sculpt, I'm first focusing on the ribcage. I do not care for the perfect number of ribs. All I really need is the 3 or 4 that show underneath the pectoralis to sell the desired effect. I also don't need individually separated rib joints, as this will make for a more expensive mesh. I just need a wholesome mesh with the necessary impressions, or the necessary indentations. As you notice, I'm not even paying attention to the ribs on the upper part of the rib cage because that detail is not going to be of any use to me. As you can see, I started off with the wrong gesture of the ribs and now had to do some correction at the end to make sure they were charting the correct path of the character's side. I also need to leave enough room in the stomach area for the sculpting of the vacuum. Now I want to reiterate, this does not need to be an anatomically accurate ribcage. I just need a sculpture that will give me the impressions I need to sell the effect. Everyone is a little different in the way the impression of the ribcage imprints superficially. It's mostly impacted by how much fat or muscle tissue you have. But there are some key landmarks with the effects that need to be captured. It also occurred to me that even if I'm not going to sculpt the details of the first couple of ribs, preserving the entire volume of the entire rib cage may be important. So I move things around to make my rib cage occupy its specified area. I will talk shortly about my plan for softening the transitions of these sculpt deformers that I am sculpting. When it comes to the abdominals, I came to the realization during sculpting that it would benefit me to include some of the muscles surrounding the abdominals. So that is the obliques and the serratus that interdigitates with the obliques. I started off doing a little bit too much detailed sculpting, and I had to remind myself that the end result would be simplified greatly when the sculpt is remeshed as a lower poly mesh from Y.E.S. I also included the mass of the obliques around the hips. Usually women don't bulge too much in that area unless they are bodybuilders, so I tried not to go too far. One thing I acknowledge is that these sculpt deformers may have to be smoothed in Maya to lose whatever faceting they inherit from this lower poly remeshing. This is a penalty that I hope doesn't slow things down too much. Ultimately, none of these sculpt deformers are going to be used directly on the skin mesh, so I think that saves me a lot in the way of performance. Now, if you remember, a few lessons ago, I was able to control the influence of my delta mush deformer by painting out the influence of its weights on her backside. Maya does not support that kind of weight painting for sculpt deformers, but I thought I'd be okay since component tags have a weight painting feature. My objective was to extend the weight painting features of component tags, which are called component falloffs, to my sculpt deformers so I could control their influence on my skin mesh. But it turns out that even though you can use component tags with sculpt deformers, the falloff feature for component tags does not extend to sculpt deformers. I didn't understand why this would be the case. Maybe in a future version of Maya, it will be supported. In the next lesson, I will showcase these component tag features and discuss a workaround that will help me to paint in and out the influence of these sculpt deformers I have created in ZBrush.